Good day. Today is Thursday, 18th September 2025, and as you can all see, I am in my accommodation in Chicago in the United States, in one of the most beautiful and extraordinary buildings, if I may say, where my hosts have accommodated me right in the center of Chicago, not far from the lake, Lake Michigan. As sometimes happens with really beautiful old buildings, and this particular old building dates from before the First World War, the lighting inside is not always as strong as we would like it to be, especially if one is doing podcasts. So I am conscious that you're seeing me in somewhat murky lighting conditions, for which of course I can only apologize. Also, as you will have noticed from the formal attire that I have on, I am making this program even as I go from one event to the other in what is turning out to be an extraordinary and exceptionally interesting day, in which I'm meeting all sorts of amazing people here in the United States, in the world of independent media, and look forward to meeting more of them. And I'm exchanging views and opinions on current affairs, on international topics. We are learning things from each other all the time. And in my case, definitely, the commentary that I'm going to do as a result will be better. Having said this, as I said, there's limited amounts of time, so again, this is going to be a shorter video, significantly shorter video than usual, for which also apologies. Anyway, let's, with that, get to the news of the last 24 hours. And in my opinion, the most important piece of news is that Zelensky had a meeting with members of his parliamentary party, around 150 of them, and he appeared for the first time publicly to concede that there is indeed a military crisis developing on the battlefronts in Ukraine. Now, I have not seen a report, an actual report of the meeting which quotes Zelensky's exact words. Quite possibly such a report exists, but I obviously wasn't at the meeting. I'm getting these reports at second and third hand. But I have no doubt that the reports that I'm getting are accurate, and it appears that Zelensky told the MPs, the members of the Ukrainian parliament, that if the situation on the battlefronts gets significantly worse, then difficult decisions might have to be made. He didn't say, of course, what those difficult decisions were. Now, that looks to me very much like Zelensky trying to prepare members of his party who have been loyally chorusing the mantra that all is well and that the situation is under control. Anyway, that looks to me like Zelensky preparing members of his party for the reality that things are not altogether well, that there is indeed going to be a military crisis, and that there is going to be very bad news from the battlefronts before very long. At least that is my understanding of what he said, and based on that understanding, that is my interpretation of what he meant. Now, he's not obviously saying yet that Ukraine is going to lose the war, but if these words are being quoted correctly, then he has come closer than he has ever done up to now to doing so. Now, that was one thing that Zelensky said. Zelensky has also, of course, been saying something different as well, because, of course, even as he appears to be admitting that the war is being lost, he's back to the old story of demanding more money from the West. And he says that Ukraine will need $120 billion to get through 2026 because he no longer expects the war to end this year. He says that he's going to do what he can to make the war end this year, but he now accepts that that is unlikely. So he needs $120 billion ultimately from the West, $60 billion to cover the budget, the military budget, another $60 billion direct aid for the military, and of course he has other demands for more money still to cover civilian needs as well. What he was talking about was purely about military costs. So we could see Zelensky doing what he always does, even as he admits or comes close to admitting that things are falling apart and that the war is being lost. He comes back and he says, give me more money. This has become the constant theme of the Zelensky government since at least the summer of 2022, when Zelensky pulled out of the Istanbul agreements, and with every month it gets louder and louder and the demands grow greater and greater. Well, that inevitably brings me now to a discussion of the military situation. And is Zelensky right? Is he actually right that the situation is deteriorating and that there might need to be major critical decisions made in light of that deterioration? Well, of course, the answer is yes. Now, the Russian commander of the forces in the area of the special military operation is General Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff. And as it happened, he did what he often does now, which is that he visited the front lines, and very unusually, he provided an update about the military situation, the situation overall on the battlefronts. Now, this is not something that the Russians have until recently done. Until fairly recently, the practice of the Russian High Command was to say as little as possible about the war and the progress of the war. That Gerasimov always used to be very, very tight-lipped about the situation. About 2 weeks ago, suddenly, over the course of a discussion about military affairs, general military affairs, chaired by the Defense Minister Andrei Belousov, Gerasimov gave a detailed military update combined with maps telling us about what the military situation on the battlefronts was. And now, a short time later, he's done it again, though obviously to a more limited extent. And I'm going to read how the Russian Defense Ministry sums up what Gerasimov has been saying, what Gerasimov's view about the overall military situation is. Our troops in the Special Military Operations Zone are advancing on almost all fronts. The most intensive fighting takes place in the Pakrovsk direction, where the enemy is unsuccessfully trying to halt our advance and seize the initiative by any means, regardless of losses. To this end, the Ukrainian command has redeployed the most trained and combat-ready units to the Pakrovsk direction, to the detriment of other areas. Such actions are facilitating the advance of our troops in other directions of the front. The Zapad group of forces is advancing in the city of Kupiansk. Advance is progressing successfully in the direction of Krasny Liman. He means the town of Liman, where the liberation of Kirovsk, I believe this is the village of Shandrikalova, is close to completion. Our troops have entered the village of Yampol and did so yesterday, and are now conducting combat operations there. We have completely driven the enemy out of the Serebianka forest. Assault units of the Yug group of forces are advancing in the village of Siversk. In other words, there's a battle underway inside Siversk itself. In the Alexandro Kalinovo direction, this is an area to the southwest of Konstantinovka, fighting is ongoing in the immediate vicinity of Konstantinovka, and our troops have entered Plusheevka. The destruction of the enemy blocked, in other words trapped, south of the Kliban-Bek reservoir continues. The Vostok group of forces continues its advance in Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporozhye regions. I would like to highlight the role of Marine units in achieving the tasks of the special military operation. In the battles near Ugledar and in Kursk, the Marines proved their superiority over the enemy and demonstrated the finest qualities of the Russian military: courage, heroism, and fortitude. There is full confidence that all the tasks assigned to you will be successfully completed. And then we're told that at the conclusion of the meeting, General Gerasimov summarized the interim results with the command of the center group of forces. These are the people who are storming Pokrovsk, and set new tasks for that direction. The Chief of the General Staff also presented state awards to the servicemen who distinguished themselves most in the liberation of the Donetsk People's Republic, and thanked them for their valor and courage in carrying out combat operations. Now, that is a detailed account of the military situation. And, well, if you've been following these programs, if you've been keeping track of the military updates we have been providing on the Duran, you will not find here very much that is new. But it does appear to confirm a lot of the information that we have been receiving, and which we have been getting, and which we have been publishing both here on this channel and also on the Duran itself. So the main battle, the heaviest fighting, is taking place in and around Pokrovsk. And here we have had a lot more information, and the information we are getting strongly supports the claims that were made about a week ago by Redovka, the Russian newspaper, that the Russians are either close to capturing or have already captured most of western Pokrovsk. Now, we've finally starting to get video footage. It shows Russian troops within Pokrovsk in precisely those areas where Redovka had placed them, and it looks as if the battle in Pokrovsk is actually approaching a crisis, with the Russians now both in the center of Pokrovsk, controlling the main roads leading into Pokrovsk from the west, which of course creates a supply crisis for the Ukrainian troops in central and southeastern Pokrovsk, where the heaviest fortifications and the higher buildings are located, and which suggests that the Battle of Pokrovsk is drawing steadily to its climactic moment, and ultimately, one suspects, to its inevitable conclusion. There's been a lot said about the situation in Kupiansk and in Zaporozhye. The fact that Gerasimov started his overview of the situation by discussing the situation in Pokrovsk and confirmed that the heaviest fighting is taking place in Pokrovsk suggests, at least to me, that for the moment, for the Russians, the battle for Pokrovsk is the most important battle. Now, Gerasimov didn't tell us very much about what is going on northeast of Pakrovsk in the area of the Russian breakthrough. What he did say was that the Ukrainians have conducted counterattacks and have tried to regain the initiative in that area, but that the counterattacks have failed and that the Russians have held their ground and that it is the Russians who continue to hold the initiative. Now, again, this has been disputed by many, including by Ukrainian commentators and bloggers and by the people who run the media channel of the First Azov Corps, which is responsible for the Ukrainian counterattacks in this area. But again, what Gerasimov is saying is consistent with what Radovka, the Russian newspaper in Smolensk, has been saying for some time, that the Ukrainian counterattacks in the area of the breakthrough have been broadly unsuccessful. And it is also consistent with video footage we're getting from this area, or perhaps one should be more precise and say the lack of video footage that we are getting from this area, because actually there hasn't been that much. So this appears to me to be the situation in Pakrovsk. It's a slog, it's a tough battle. The Ukrainians understand fully how important Pakrovsk is. They understand that if Pakrovsk falls, their entire front line will start to collapse. I am guessing, by the way, that the reason why Zelensky is talking about a deteriorating situation and the Ukrainians having to make critical decisions, but what has triggered those comments is precisely the increasingly bad news from Pakrovsk. And anyway, we will see how the situation develops there over the next couple of days. But there are reports that the Russians have transferred more troops to this area, specifically that they've transferred the 8th Army, perhaps 10,000-20,000 men, to reinforce their forces in the northeast area of Pakrovsk. I am going to make a guess that when the Ukrainian counterattack has run its course, the Russians will themselves go onto the attack in the northeast Pakrovsk area, relying on these fresh troops who have now been introduced to the battle. And in the meantime, the Russians will continue to clear the rest of the city of Pakrovsk itself, and will take steps to defeat the Ukrainian garrison that is located there. So that is one thing that Gerasimov has told us. Now, he has told us other things too. He's talked about the situation in the Konstantinovka area. Now, here, it must be said that what he is saying is consistent with what most of the mapping projects have been saying, that the Russians have indeed cleared territory to the east of Konstantinovka. This is where this village of Plosheyevka that he mentioned is located. Gerasimov also spoke about the Ukrainian troops south of the Kliban-Bek area being in a cauldron, and about the Russians needing to do more to basically end their resistance there. And I suspect there's going to be more fighting in this area too, but this is consistent with what we've been getting from the mapping projects. Now, Gerasimov also confirmed the reports, which are now coming from the Ukrainians as well, that the Ukrainians have been entirely pushed out of the Serebyanka and I believe also the adjoining Kremenaya forests. He says he's repeated again the claim that fighting is underway inside the town limits of Siversk itself. He hasn't provided much detail, and there's a lot of confusing information coming from this area. There's drone footage that the Russians have been releasing, which shows heavy bombing in Siversk itself, which could be consistent with fighting going on in Siversk. And we've also had Ukrainian mapping projects like DS, Deep State, showing large belts of territory immediately to the north of Siversk in the grey zone. In other words, contested by the Ukrainians and by the Russians. So it's clear that there is a lot of fighting going on in this area. My own guess is that, as happened with Ugledar last October, Siversk is effectively encircled. In fact, it is probably now too late for the Ukrainians to withdraw their garrison from there. And, well, Gerasimov also confirms that the Russians have entered the village of Yampol. I think when he said that the Russians have entered Yampol, he means the central part of Yampol, not some agricultural buildings located immediately to the north of this town. And it looks like battle for this territory is being intensified. And, well, of course, if Yampol is indeed captured by the Russians, as I am sure it will be, then it is indeed the case that the garrison in Siversk is in a trap. And, of course, Gerasimov also discussed the situation in Kupiansk and about the fact that the Russians are continuing steadily to clear Kupiansk. Now, over the last 3 weeks or so, I have speculated that the Ukrainians might withdraw from Kupiansk and Siversk. Always we come back to this. I've always looked at the situation of Ukrainian troops in town after town, village after village. I've wrestled with myself trying to understand why Zelensky, because ultimately it is he, insists on keeping them there. The result is that they stay there. They're below the Kliban-Bik reservoir, where they should have been evacuated from weeks ago. They're still in Siversk, which, as I said, is essentially encircled. They're still in Kupiansk, which is also essentially encircled. It's almost certain now that it is virtually impossible for the Ukrainians to evacuate their troops from these places. Probably some brave souls will escape, but there will be very few, and most of the others who do will be caught out in the open on the increasingly cold and wet fields and forests hunted by the Russian drones and the Russian infantry. Well, I always ask myself, I always say to myself, whenever these kind of situations arise, surely this time Zelensky is going to withdraw his forces from these places. And of course he never does. He keeps them there, sacrificing their lives, as far as I can see, to no useful military purpose. And over the course of the last week, we have seen why he does this. I go back to those extraordinary comments made by General Kellogg. Somebody, by the way, pointed out to me that they bear an uncanny resemblance to certain comments made by General Turgidson, the fictional American general in the spoof Cold War film Dr. Strangelove. Just saying. Anyway, Kellogg telling us that the Ukrainians are winning, that the Russians are useless, that The Russians talk a big game. General Turgison in Dr. Strangelove said exactly the same thing. The Russians talk a big game, but basically they're short of tech, and that the Americans could whip their ass and all of that. That's what General Kellogg said. And as has been pointed out by myself on these programs, by Alex and myself on the Duran, and perhaps most effectively by Alex on his channel, Alex Christoforou on his channel, it's now absolutely clear that General Kellogg is getting his understanding of the war and of what is happening in the war from Zelensky and the Ukrainians. Apparently, it never crosses his mind that they might be telling him anything less than the whole truth. And he passes this on to President Trump, to Donald Trump. And of course, what Trump hears from Kellogg then goes on to inform his decisions. So this is why Zelensky won't withdraw the troops from Kupiansk, the Klibanbik Reservoir and Siversk until it becomes impossible to do so. Because withdrawing from these towns and these territories would be an admission that Ukraine is not winning the war, that on the contrary, it is losing the war. Lives of soldiers are being sacrificed so that Zelensky can keep stringing Donald Trump along, and they were just as they were being sacrificed before for effectively the same reason, so that Zelensky could string along Joe Biden and other Western leaders, even as he went ahead and did what he continues to do now, which is demand more and more money and more weapons and more economic aid and more of those kind of things. Demands that never cease, never reduce, which on the contrary grow all the time and which by now are completely insatiable. So there it is. That's the reality. Now, of course, because Zelensky won't withdraw troops from undefendable positions, the battles in these positions become astonishingly protracted. That enables people to come forward and say, well, it's taking the Russians very long to capture places like Kupiansk, Siversk, the Klibanbik Reservoir and Pokrovsk. What people who do that never do is ask themselves whether buying time in this way is worth the cost, because the cost in lives is exorbitant and it is getting worse. And to repeat again, I believe I now have an accurate picture of Ukrainian losses. I've explained why in previous programs, and on the basis of my understanding, of my knowledge rather, of Ukrainian losses, well, all I will say is I know exactly how much Ukraine is paying every day for the losses it is suffering to hold on to these impossible, undefendable positions. I read, by the way, a deeply distressing article sent to me by the estimable British historian Jeff Roberts. It was an article about the anguish Ukrainian families feel when bodily remains of dead Ukrainian soldiers are provided to Ukraine by Russia, that many Ukrainian families don't know what has happened to their loved ones on the field of battle. As I want to stress, this article was about the remains of soldiers transferred to Ukraine from Russia, and it spoke about sometimes the problems with identification of the soldiers in question. I'm not going to go into those details. But for me, the saddest thing was reading about the anguish that these families feel because they don't know what has happened to their loved ones. And, well, reading that not only distresses me, but it frankly makes me sometimes, well, angry, more angry than I want to admit. On that topic, I would just say that the person who the Ukrainian authorities are claiming was the assassin of Andrei Parubi, the Ukrainian ultranationalist politician and former militia leader, the person who has admitted, by the way, to being the assassin of Parubi. He has explained his reasons for the murder of Parubi, his murder of Parubi. He has explained them on the basis of anger that he feels over the fate of his son, who is, by the way, as far as I understand it, supposedly missing in action. Anyway, that's a few areas of the battlefronts. The other area where things continue to move forward at increasingly rapid speed, only briefly touched on, by the way, by Gerasimov in this update, is the Zaporozhye region, where the Russian advance continues relentlessly. The Russians are now definitely, there's video footage of this, fighting to capture the town of Stepnogorsk, south of Zaporozhye city, and the village of Primorye, also south of Zaporozhye city. If they capture these two places, they will be very close to the city of Zaporozhye indeed, well within drone range. And of course, they will also be in a position to strike Ukrainian convoys and movements along the roads from Zaporozhye eastwards towards the Ukrainian forces that are being pushed back by the Russians as this remorseless Russian advance from the east heading towards Zaporozhye city in the west and to the Dnieper River continues. Anyway, there we go. That's what I wanted to say. Now, there is one final point before I leave discussion of the military situation, which is that the fact that Gerasimov is now engaging in this practice of providing us with regular military updates about the state of the battle is itself a sign of growing confidence. It means that the Russians, Gerasimov, no longer worry that what the chief of the general staff is going to say one day will have to be taken back the next because of the ebb and flow of the battle. It means that the Russians believe that they not only have the initiative, but that they're going to keep it and that they're going to continue advancing. It is a sign of growing Russian confidence, and, well, one can see why. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the military situation in Ukraine. Now, all kinds of other things are taking place. Ursula von der Leyen has come up with two unbelievably overcomplicated and completely illogical mechanisms to basically use the Russian assets, the frozen Russian assets, to assist Ukraine. Given the cut-off of financial aid from the United States, direct financial aid from the United States to Ukraine, it's probably not a total cut-off, but at least a significant cut-off. There is a hole in the funding. The Europeans are desperately short of funds because every European state, of the big ones at least, without exception, is experiencing a budget crisis. So they have no money to spend, or at least insufficient money to spend on Ukraine to meet Zelensky's insatiable needs. Just saying. Anyway, Ursula von der Leyen, clearly under pressure of that, is once again revisiting the whole issue of Russia's frozen assets, and she comes up with these elaborate plans to try to do so. I'm not going to try to unpack them. Euroclear, the depository in which some of these assets are found, has already expressed its strong disagreement with this course. I have already made my own view clear. Not only do these various ideas not work, in the sense that they are clearly intended to confiscate assets that belong to someone else, but because of the complexity of these proposals, they are in effect an admission of the illegality of the step that it is proposed should be taken. We shall see whether Western leaders, whether Western governments, European leaders and governments are prepared to go down this course. Anyway, I'm not going to go into the details in this program, but there's been a whole cascade of articles across Europe in which European leaders come forward, European newspapers come forward and make it quite clear that Donald Trump's demands that the Europeans impose not just sweeping sanctions on Russia and refuse to import Russian oil and gas, but also join the United States in massive tariffs against India and China. Anyway, there's been articles all over the media effectively confirming that European governments in their totality are refusing to take this step. Now, the most extraordinary editorial of all, as far as I'm concerned, on this very topic is in The Guardian. And of course, The Guardian is one of the most fervid supporters of Ukraine in the media which you can possibly find. And of course, the article, the editorial, I should say, it's not just an article, it is a full editorial, is a huge criticism of Donald Trump. It says that Donald Trump's Ukraine strategy, talking tough and doing very little, isn't working. And then he goes on to say that Trump has made all kinds of threats to take strong action against Vladimir Putin, but has never done so. And then the article goes on to say this: eyeing a considerable economic prize, Washington is insisting that the EU must increase its imports of liquefied natural gas at a rate that analysts judge undoable. Other demands include the imposition by the EU of 50 to 100% tariffs on Russia's most important ally, China, and an end to all imports of Russian oil by NATO members. This includes Turkey, which has refused to sanction Moscow, imports 57% of its oil from Russia, and lies outside the EU. Those looking on the bright side in Brussels hope that Mr. Trump's visit is going to lead to a change of approach, but of course it won't, and that Mr. Trump's pressure on may persuade MAGA-friendly governments in Hungary and Slovakia to end their deep dependence on Russian energy imports. That is extremely unlikely to happen, as Mr. Trump and his advisors must know. Nor can the EU afford to court the kind of economic retaliation from Beijing that caused Mr. Trump himself to back down from a full-blown trade war recently. Now, all of that is true. Every single comment made there is absolutely true. The EU cannot afford to do the kind of things that Trump is asking the EU to do, to impose 50 to 100% tariffs on China and India, to stop importing Russian oil and gas. It can't do those things. So why then demand that the Americans do? Why demand that the Americans step up sanctions against Russia when the EU cannot step up sanctions against Russia? The entire editorial criticizes Donald Trump for inaction on the sanctions front without specifying in any place what sanctions The Guardian thinks Donald Trump should impose. And, well, I'm singling out The Guardian here, but this, of course, reflects the attitudes, the opinions of European governments, and The Guardian is known to be very close to Keir Starmer and his government, and undoubtedly reflects their own views of the matter. So, we are talking absurdities, demanding sanctions, which everybody agrees would backfire and are impossible, blaming Trump when we don't impose them, talking about security guarantees, which the Polish foreign minister, Radek Sikorski, says nobody's going to give because nobody's going to really want to defend Ukraine. What are we doing? What are we talking about when we talk about things in this way? We're just retreating into memes and cliches and poses. And, of course, when we criticize Donald Trump without actually explaining what it is, in fact, that we want him to do in the way that The Guardian is saying, well, you could see that we're already in the recrimination game, that as Ukraine gets defeated, what we're all going to start to do from this point on is we're going to point fingers at each other and say, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. It's Trump because you weren't tough enough. It's the EU because you weren't prepared to give up on Russian oil. It's the Saudis for maintaining the OPEC plus alliance with the Russians. They're to blame. It's the Chinese and the Indians because they're buying Russian oil. It's always someone's fault, never an admission that the entire approach right from the outset has been wrong. By the way, there was a powerful article in the New York Times about the idea of establishing a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine. And the New York Times made an entirely simple point. They said that even if the fighter jets, the Western fighter jets, were to enter Western Ukraine and to concentrate purely on shooting down Russian Duran drones, even if the Russians did not come after them and try to shoot those Western fighter jets down, which, by the way, I don't believe, before very long, given the sheer numbers of Duran drones that the Russians now launch against Ukraine, the Western air forces would deplete their missiles. They'd run through all their super expensive air-to-air missiles, shooting down Duran drones. There would come a point where the no-fly zone would collapse because there would be no weapons left. Now, again, this is obvious. Nobody really, I think, is intending to impose a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine. So why discuss it? Why propose it at all? Why not address these logistical challenges, which are every bit as overwhelming and as great as the New York Times is suggesting? Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. That's the situation in Ukraine. There are other things going on in the world. One of the most important but least noticed actions that have been taken over the last 24 hours is that the Chinese government has banned Chinese companies from buying chips made by NVIDIA. NVIDIA was offering advanced chips to China, but not so advanced that they would infringe on America's current monopoly of the highest end chips produced, not so far in the United States itself, apparently, but still in Taiwan. Anyway, I'm not going to get into the logistics of it, but the Chinese have rejected imports of these chips that the Americans were offering from NVIDIA, and the Chinese are saying that they're going to develop their own even more advanced chips. And apparently there's increasing evidence that the Chinese are almost on a technological breakout in this area as well. I'm not going to pretend that I have all of the information, not at all, in fact, but I would not be surprised if the Chinese are now very close to getting on top of the ultraviolet lithography process and are close to building machines of that kind themselves. The Russians, by the way, who during the Soviet period were at the forefront in technological developments in lithography, have recently started making their own lithography machines. As everybody endlessly reminds me, they are much more, they produce much inferior chips. These are not lithography machines that are capable of producing the most advanced chips. Again, this misunderstands the reality. The key thing is to build a lithography machine. Enormously huge, complicated machines. You need to understand the industrial process of making them. You need to establish proper supply chains because the component parts are myriad and many of them are very complex. Once you are able to build one, and obviously the one that the Russians have built is a test run, then you understand what the process is. You can then work through, you can look at all the various components, you can talk to the suppliers, you can upgrade and perfect the machine, and then you can move on. And your next machine will be more advanced, and in the meantime, your laboratories, the ones run by Rosatom, are going to be working on producing machines which approach and perhaps in time will equal the sophistication of the ones being made in the Netherlands and which are operated in Taiwan. People in the West have an extraordinarily exaggerated idea of American capabilities and superiority, or at least I should say not American, Western superiority in this area. It's very like what happened in the 1940s with nuclear weapons technology. The United States at that time assumed that it would take the Soviet Union 8 or 10 years to catch up with the United States and develop nuclear weapons. They didn't expect the Soviet Union to have a nuclear weapon until the mid 1950s. 1953, I seem to remember, was the date. The Russians acquired nuclear weapons capability. They exploded their first nuclear device in 4 years, not 8, not 10. And of course, the Chinese, who have far greater resources than the Soviets did in the 1940s, can certainly sort out the complexities of building advanced lithography machines in a few years. And the Russians obviously have fewer resources, but I expect that they will do the same in a few years also. My guess, my speculation, is that by the early 2030s, the Chinese and the Russians will have drawn level with this technology. And of course, there may be other technologies coming, but they will all be moving forward with that too. Anyway, I digress. The other interesting piece of news is that Exxon has now said that it has no plans for the moment, or at least no plans, to return to Russia. There were reports circulating a few weeks ago that there'd been meetings between American and Russian energy companies. There was a meeting between Rosneft and Exxon in the UAE to discuss Exxon's return to Russia. I pointed out in a program that I made shortly after those reports appeared that I had learnt several months ago about these contacts and had been informed about them from a source in Russia. And this contact told me that it was the Americans who had initiated the contacts, but that the Russian government had advised the Russian energy companies, who had been approached not just by Exxon, but by Chevron as well, to steer clear, to make no definite commitments. And it looks as if those discussions, probably for that reason, have now hit a wall. In the meantime, the Russians continue to press the Americans for the resumption of direct air links between the United States and Russia. The Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov has now talked about this, and perhaps that is indeed coming. Anyway, this is where I'm going to stop today's program. The big news are the big military developments in Ukraine and the dawning realization on Zelensky's part as to what is happening. We are probably not far from that point when places like Kupiansk, Siversk, Liman, Pokrovsk fall, when even a deluded individual, such as General Kellogg appears to be, is no longer going to be able to hide behind the briefings he's getting from the Ukrainians, and is no longer going to be able to persist in his denials. What will happen at that point remains to be seen. Donald Trump continues on his trip to Britain. He's holding a press conference with Keir Starmer, even as I make this program. More from that tomorrow, but this is where I end my program today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this platform, to this channel rather. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.